The control tower at Salone Airfield went silent the moment the radio hissed its last words. Fuel, zero, losing power. Then nothing, just static, the kind that feels like a funeral already starting. A lone P-47 Thunderbolt was somewhere over the Adriatic, limping home after a brutal escort mission. The pilot had taken flak, lost half his fuel, and flown nearly an hour farther than the jug was ever meant to go. The ground crews scribbled the same note in their logs: aircraft lost. But 20 minutes later, a spotter on the ridge yelled, "Contact! One bird coming in slow!" Head snapped upward. There it was. A silver P-47 drifting over the coastline like a ghost, canopy glinting in the late afternoon sun. Too slow, too quiet, too steady. No engine roar, no prop blur. Just gliding. "Impossible," one mechanic whispered. "She should have dropped like a stone." The pilot's voice crackled again at the edge of reception. "Still airborne, still no power, controls light, descending stable." Fuel trucks rolled out anyway, though everyone knew they'd be useless. Fire crews followed, expecting the worst. The P-47 sank lower, wings rocking gently, as if riding an invisible staircase carved into the sky. The propeller spun lazily, not driven by the motor, but by the wind alone. The tower chief muttered, "How the hell is that thing still flying?" The plane kissed the runway in complete silence. A perfect dead-stick landing. The wheels chirped, the tail settled, the jug rolled to a stop without a sputter, a cough, or a single drop of remaining fuel. Crew chiefs sprinted forward. They popped the caps, checked the gauges, traced every fuel line. Empty, bone dry. As in, not enough fuel to taxi, let alone fly 6 extra hours. Someone finally asked the pilot, dazed and trembling, "How'd you keep her in the air?" He pointed weakly toward the propeller. "Wasn't me," he said. "It was the way that thing grabbed the wind. Felt like the air wanted to hold us up." All eyes turned to the man already standing at the edge of the crowd. Lean, grease-covered, arms crossed, watching with the quiet satisfaction of someone who already knew the answer. Staff Sergeant Roy Bennett, prop specialist, tinkerer, rule breaker. The man everyone called that crazy blade doctor. The pilot stared at him. "Your fix. Whatever you did, it saved my life." Bennett didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't say a word. He just whispered under his breath, "Engines run on fuel, wings run on air. But props run on secrets." What no one knew yet, not the pilot, not the colonel, not even the men holding the empty fuel lines, was that Bennett's secret was never supposed to exist. The design had been banned, buried, rejected years earlier as dangerous, and tonight it had rewritten physics. Before that day, every man in the Army Air Force believed the same gospel. Fuel is flight. The manuals said it. The instructors drilled it. The engineers tattooed it into every system they built. A P-47 Thunderbolt needed power the way a man needed lungs. At full military throttle, it burned fuel faster than any fighter in the European theater. Everyone knew the numbers by heart. 2 hours, maybe 3 if you babied the engine. Anything more was science fiction. So the moment Bennett's miracle plane rolled to a stop with empty tanks, the disbelief hit harder than flak. The tower chief barked, "Check the gauges again." "They're dry, sir." "Impossible. Nothing flies without fuel." But Bennett had never believed that. In every briefing, every hangar lecture, he'd mutter the same heresy under his breath. "Engines don't keep you up. Air does." To the rest of the Air Force, that was nonsense. The propeller existed to spin, push air backward, and keep the plane moving. Simple, predictable, and above all, regulated. But Bennett saw the propeller differently. He saw it as a wind instrument, something that could capture energy even after the engine died. He watched the way the blades twisted in crosswinds, the way turbulence made them dance, the way a P-47 could glide farther with the prop locked than with it spinning freely. Where others saw dead metal, he saw a turbine waiting to wake up. Most mechanics didn't question doctrine. Bennett questioned everything. Why did some planes glide smoother after battle damage? Why did damaged props sometimes feather themselves? Why did rejected prototype blades outperform approved models in certain tests? Each answer pointed him toward the same forbidden idea. Drag wasn't a problem. It was unharvested power. That idea had gotten him in trouble before. During training, he modified a trainer prop to test wind capture at idle. The instructor grounded him for a week. In North Africa, he reshaped a blade tip with a torch. The base chief threatened to court-martial him. In Italy, he requested permission to test a variable feather tip design. Command stamped the paperwork in red. Denied, unsafe. That should have been the end of it. For everyone else, it would have been. But Bennett didn't stop. He waited, he watched, he collected scraps. He studied airflow the way snipers studied bullet drop. And then, on a dusty airfield in southern Italy, he finally found a P-47 brave, or desperate, enough to carry his banned idea into the sky. The plane that landed 6 hours later wasn't just an aircraft returning home. It was proof the myth had been wrong all along. Long before he was bending Army regulations, Roy Bennett was bending metal in a barn outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. The son of a tractor mechanic and a dust-streaked mother who taught school out of a one-room shack, Bennett grew up surrounded by wind, the kind that rattled boards, rolled tumbleweeds, and whispered through the wheat like a living thing. Most boys learned to ride. Bennett learned to listen. At age 10, he built a wind bicycle out of scrap tin blades bolted to his handlebars. It didn't go fast, it didn't even go straight. But when the prairie gusts caught the blades, the wheels spun without his feet touching the pedals. His dad just shook his head. "Boy, you ain't right," he muttered. Bennett grinned. "Maybe not. But the wind sure is." He spent his teenage years fixing engines at the local crop duster strip. No manuals, no supervision, just instinct. He watched propellers warp in the heat, vibrate in crosswinds, twist under load. He saw how a bent blade sometimes reduced drag instead of increasing it. Every mechanic cursed those anomalies. Bennett wrote them down. By the time he turned 18, the war had come calling. He enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces as a propeller specialist and shipped off to Florida for training. His instructors quickly learned one thing. The kid from Tulsa hated rules almost as much as he loved airflow. During a maintenance drill, Bennett adjusted a prop governor without permission. "Why'd you touch that setting, recruit?" the tech sergeant barked. "It was fighting the wind wrong," Bennett said. "Wrong? The engineers designed it." "Engineers weren't standing where I was." That exchange earned him a week of KP duty and a reputation. The mad fan. But what irritated his instructors fascinated the pilots. They liked the quiet kid who could diagnose a vibration by ear, who could tell from the prop sound whether a plane was climbing or dying. In 1943, Bennett deployed to Italy with the P-47 Thunderbolt group. The airfields were muddy, the tools scarce, and the supply lines a mess. Pilots pushed their engines to the edge every day. And Bennett started noticing a pattern. The Jug's massive four-blade prop, when windmilling at idle or shutdown, sometimes generated a strange stabilizing lift. A damaged blade could unexpectedly flatten the glide. A worn pitch mechanism sometimes locked the blades just right for long descents. None of it was in the manuals. All of it was in his notebook. By winter, he had a theory. If he reshaped the blade tips to capture airflow after fuel burnout, a P-47 could glide like a sailplane, maybe for hours. But such blade alterations were explicitly forbidden. The order was clear. No field modifications to prop geometry. Most men would have stopped there. Roy Bennett sharpened his tools. Everyone in the Air Force talked about horsepower, bragged about it, worshipped it, blamed it when things went wrong. But Roy Bennett didn't care about horsepower. He cared about the enemy every pilot forgot. Drag. Drag killed more planes than the Luftwaffe ever did. It robbed speed, stole lift, and turned a healthy engine into a coughing brick. And on the P-47 Thunderbolt, a flying brick even on its best days, drag was the invisible anchor tied to every mission. Bennett dug into the numbers the way a gambler studies odds. He learned the things no one talked about at briefings. At cruise power, the P-47 burned 200 gallons of fuel per hour. A drop tank extended range, but only if the pilot didn't touch the throttle wrong. The moment the engine died, the giant four-blade prop turned into a spinning wall. Wind-milling drag was so strong it could cut the jug's glide range in half. Instructors told pilots, "If your engine quits, look for a field. You're not making it home." To Bennett, that was quitting. He started doing back-of-the-envelope math at night, lying on a cot with a flashlight and a pencil stub. If drag could be reduced by even 20%, a dead-engine P-47 could glide an extra 20 miles. Reduce it 30%? You might double that. Reduce it 40%? You might not need an engine at all. He wasn't dreaming. He was calculating. He studied glider designs the way snipers study wind charts. Sailplane pilots in the Alps rode thermals for hours with no power. Their secret? Slim blades, feathering props, clean airflow. The P-47's propeller wasn't slim. It was a monstrosity. 4 slabs of steel designed for brute force, not finesse. But Bennett saw something others didn't. The outer 10% of each blade did most of the work. The rest was just drag dressed as engineering. He tested his theory the only way he could avoid discipline, by watching damaged planes. When a blade tip got clipped, sometimes the jug glided better on its dead engine return. When a pitch actuator jammed at a strange angle, the plane could descend twice as far. These accidents were teaching him more than any manual. The math lined up beautifully, terrifyingly. If he could reshape the blade tips just slightly, a twist here, a taper there, the wind itself would spin the propeller into a natural feather. No more windmilling drag, no more stalled descents, no more dead pilots. But the manual was absolute. Propeller geometry is not to be altered under any circumstances. Because in the laboratories of Wright Field, a similar experimental design had once caused a runaway prop, a blade failure that tore the cowling apart like confetti. The engineers banned the concept forever. Bennett knew the risk, he knew the rules, but he also knew this: the rules weren't written for men flying home on empty tanks. And somewhere in his mind, the numbers kept whispering the same truth. Drag wasn't a death sentence. It was a problem begging to be solved. The moment came on a night when everything smelled like failure: burnt oil, hot metal, and fear. 3 P-47s had limped back from a long-range escort mission over Germany. All 3 had taken engine hits. All 3 landed with the same story. We lost power. We barely made it home. One didn't make it home at all. It pancaked into a field 2 miles short of the runway. The pilot crawled out alive. The plane didn't. Bennett stared at the wreckage like it was a crime scene, because to him it was. Drag had killed that pilot's engine long before flak did. At 2:37 a.m., he made his decision. He would break the law of the manual. He would alter the propeller geometry. He would test the idea no engineer dared touch since the Pentagon banned it. He slipped into the maintenance hangar with a flashlight between his teeth and a hacksaw in his hand. Rain hammered the tin roof. The base slept. Only the grease smell kept him company. The test subject was a battered P-47D with a cracked turbo line and 1 dead magneto, stuck in the repair later corner like a forgotten carcass. But Bennett didn't need the engine. He needed the prop. He ran his hand along the leading edge of the blade. "Too much steel," he whispered. Then he marked the outer 6 inches with chalk. Every pilot knew the blade tips were sacred. Every mechanic knew touching them meant losing your stripes. Bennett didn't care. He saw the truth the rules refused to see. A spinning brick was worse than a stationary wing. The hacksaw bit through the first blade. Sparks danced. Metal screamed. When he finished cutting, the blade looked wrong. Shorter, lighter, oddly tapered. But the airflow numbers in his head smiled. He repeated the cut on blade 2, then 3, then 4. When he was done, the propeller looked like something from a scrapyard experiment. Brutal, uneven, radical. But the geometry did exactly what the math promised. Less mass at the tip, less rotational inertia, less windmilling drag, more natural feathering in engine-out conditions. He rebalanced the hub with fishing weights, smoothed the edges with a file, filed until the metal gleamed like a mirror. Then, the final step. The one that crossed the line, not just bent it. He adjusted the pitch-stop bolts, twisted them 2 degrees beyond their safe range, forced the blades to sit at an angle completely outside regulation tolerances. If the engine ran, the prop would bite harder. But if the engine died, the prop would feather faster, almost instantly. It was illegal. It was genius. It was insane. At 4:11 a.m., he wiped the sweat off his face, looked at the monstrous propeller he'd created, and whispered, "Let's see if physics is on my side." The plane wouldn't fly itself. He needed a pilot desperate enough, or crazy enough, to test an unproven propeller that could save his life or tear itself off the aircraft. That pilot was about to knock on the hangar door. Captain Ray Collier entered the hangar with the look of a man walking toward a firing squad. His P-47 had blown a cylinder the previous week. The replacement wasn't ready, and Command had just assigned him a 6-hour reconnaissance run, a mission so long most Thunderbolts didn't even attempt it without praying over the fuel gauges. 4 hours was normal. 6 was lunacy. Then he saw Bennett crouched beside the modified propeller, hands black with grease, metal filings scattered like glitter across the floor. The blades didn't look damaged. They looked deliberately altered. Collier knelt beside him and traced the blade tips with his thumb. They'd been shortened and sealed with an unfamiliar resin. The pitch stops had been reset well beyond regulation. It took him a moment to process what he was seeing. "Bennett, you cut the blades." Bennett didn't look up. "Yep, and filed them flat." "Correct." "And changed the pitch limits?" "You bet your ass I did." Collier exhaled through his teeth. "You know this is court-martial level stupid." Only then did Bennett lift his eyes. "So is sending you on a 480-mile recon mission with an engine that gulps fuel like a drunk at a wedding. At least one of us is trying to keep you alive." Then he added quietly, "This prop buys you an hour of glide. Maybe more. If the engine quits, it'll feather itself. You'll fly farther dead stick than a German can fly alive." That was all Collier needed. Pilots didn't survive by worshipping the manual. They survived by trusting the one person who touched their plane more than they did. He climbed into the cockpit without another argument, while Bennett stood on the wing giving final instructions. "If it surges, throttle back gently. Don't fight it." Collier smirked. "If it surges, I'll pray instead." The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The modified prop spun with a deeper, tighter hum. Less vibration, less drag, almost unnervingly smooth. The Thunderbolt rolled down the runway and lifted off 10 knots earlier than usual. When Collier pushed into his climb, the aircraft surged upward with an eagerness no P-47 had any right to have. Bennett watched from the ground, arms crossed, heart pounding as the plane clawed skyward 18% faster than spec. 2 hours later, over empty ocean, Collier radioed in. "She's smooth. She's clean. Bennett, what the hell did you do?" Bennett didn't respond. He just stared at the sky like a man watching a secret trying to escape. Then came the glide test. Collier throttled back and the altered prop feathered almost instantly. The plane didn't float. It sliced, holding airspeed with impossible efficiency. Over a 2,000-foot descent, it behaved like a soaring hawk, not a 7-ton war machine. As the hours dragged on, The disbelief in Collier's voice only grew. "I think I can stay up here forever," he reported after the 5th hour, half laughing, half terrified. He didn't stay forever, but he did stay airborne for 6 hours, 5 minutes, and 19 seconds, a squadron record and a feat no stock Thunderbolt could touch. When he landed, he climbed out with shaky legs and wide eyes, whispering, "That wasn't a flight, that was a miracle." For Bennett, the meaning was clear. His forbidden propeller design wasn't reckless improvisation. It was the next step in fighter evolution. And it had just rewritten what a P-47 could do. Dawn broke over the North Atlantic like a blade of dull steel as Collier approached the first leg of his mission. Recon runs weren't glamorous. They weren't heroic. They were long, lonely flights over open water, trying not to run out of fuel, not to freeze, and not to get ambushed by fighters you'd never even hear coming. This one was worse. A 6-hour loop designed solely because higher command needed photographic proof of a suspected Kriegsmarine buildup along a string of remote harbors. Every other pilot briefed for the mission had quietly hoped they wouldn't be chosen. Collier didn't hope. He just accepted. And Bennett's forbidden propeller was now the only thing keeping the mission from becoming a suicide note. The first 2 hours went smoothly. Too smoothly. The gauges barely moved, the Thunderbolt held altitude like a patient giant, and the modified propeller felt less like a hacked-together experiment, and more like an invisible engine upgrade. But by hour 3, trouble arrived. Thin bands of cloud formed over the water, the kind that hid Messerschmitt scouts like wolves slipping through tall grass. Collier dipped beneath them and scanned for silhouettes, but there were no fighters, just empty sky. Empty ocean, and wind. The wind was the real threat. A sudden cross-current slammed the P-47 sideways, nearly ripping the stick from Collier's hand. He caught it, righted the plane, and muttered to himself, "Easy, girl, stay with me." A lesser prop would have choked on the sudden drag spike. Bennett's modified blades sliced through it like a knife. The RPM stayed rock solid. The climb rate didn't sag. Collier's confidence grew, and so did his willingness to push the machine. He descended toward the first target area, a small inlet carved into a cliffside village. Recon photos required precision flying, low passes, stable turns, and the kind of speed control that made or broke an entire report. With the forbidden prop design, Collier found himself gliding instead of fighting the air. He lined up the camera run and dropped altitude until the ocean spray almost kissed the belly of the plane. He triggered the camera. The film reel clicked like a heartbeat. 1 pass, 2, 3, no fighters, no flak. Just the rhythmic hum of a propeller working smarter than anything Lockheed had officially designed. Then came the part that should have doomed him. The second recon point lay deeper inland, over a narrow fjord system notorious for sudden downdrafts. As Collier banked into the valley, the air collapsed beneath him. The P-47 dropped nearly 400 feet in seconds. The altimeter spun like a wheel. Collier cursed and shoved the throttle forward, expecting the engine to strain under the sudden load. Instead, Bennett's altered pitch setting bit into the air, rebuilt lift, and pulled the Thunderbolt upward with brutal efficiency. The plane didn't just recover. It climbed. Hard. "You monster," Collier whispered to the propeller, half in awe, half in fear. By the 5-hour mark, he had completed all photo runs and plotted a return route under a slowly setting sun. Ordinarily, this would be where the nightmare began. The moment when fuel ran thin, the engine grew temperamental, and pilots started calculating whether ditching or drifting would give them a better chance at survival. But not today. The gauges showed fuel reserves no P-47 had any business having after such a mission. It was as if the plane had been drinking water instead of burning aviation fuel. When the coastline finally came into view, Collier felt an emotion rare for reconnaissance: triumph. He hadn't cheated death. He had outrun it. And Bennett's forbidden propeller, the thing everyone laughed at, warned against, and swore would get someone killed, had just completed one of the longest Thunderbolt recon missions of the war. But as Collier lowered his gear and prepared to land, he didn't know the truth. This wasn't the miracle. This was only the first proof. By the time Collier taxied onto the ramp, the sun had dipped low enough to smear the entire airfield in gold. The ground crews stepped back when they saw him climb out, not stumbling from exhaustion, not collapsing from dehydration, but standing tall, breathing steady, and looking like a man who had somehow cheated the rules of nature. His Thunderbolt engine clicked as it cooled, the prop still spinning with a lazy momentum that made no sense for a machine that had just flown 6 straight hours. Mechanics stared at the untouched fuel gauges, whispering to each other like parishioners witnessing a miracle they weren't sure they were allowed to believe in. 6 hours, Collier said to the squadron commander, dropping into a folding chair, and she'd have given me 7. The commander blinked. That's impossible. Collier gestured toward the aircraft. Then go tell that. Word spread across the airfield within minutes. Pilots, armorers, mechanics, even cooks drifted toward the P-47 like moths converging on a lantern. Bennett stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, pretending not to care. Inside, he felt the pressure of every eye, waiting for the moment someone asked the question he had no legal answer for. And they asked, all at once. What did you do? How'd you tune it? Is it reproducible? Will command approve it? Bennett shrugged. No. No, yes. And hell no. But the celebration didn't last. Just before sunset, the siren screamed, the long rising howl that meant incoming enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe had launched a harassment strike, a mix of night fighters and fast raiders designed to catch fuel depots and bomb-laden aircraft on the ground. Men sprinted for trenches, extinguished lamps, kicked sand over lit cigarettes. Engines roared to life as ready aircraft scrambled for takeoff. Collier was halfway to the shelter when the commander grabbed his arm. Take your plane, now. She's not fueled for combat, Collier protested. She just flew 6 hours on a tank meant for 4. Get in. Bennett didn't argue. He pushed the pilot toward the ladder and slapped the fuselage twice, the universal mechanic's blessing. Collier fired the engine. The modified prop spun with the same impossible smoothness, even at combat throttle. As he rolled for takeoff, anti-aircraft bursts lit the sky. 2 Luftwaffe raiders dove toward the runway, spraying machine gun fire in long silver arcs. Collier yanked back on the stick, wheels leaving the ground just as tracers stitched the pavement beneath him. What happened next became squadron folklore. A P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy, stubborn, never known for elegance, climbed like a homesick angel straight through a vertical engagement the Luftwaffe never expected. The altered prop bit into the cold night air, turning drag into thrust with an efficiency bordering on supernatural. The altimeter spun upward so fast Collier had to regulate the climb to avoid overstressing the wings. Ahead, 2 German fighters streaked by, banking hard for another pass. But their tight turns bled energy the P-47 didn't lose. Collier pushed the throttle forward and felt the modified prop lock into a higher efficiency pitch. The Thunderbolt lunged ahead, not gradually, violently. Within 20 seconds, he was on the tail of the first raider, a Ju-88. The enemy pilot banked, expecting the sluggish American plane to stall or overshoot. Instead, Collier stayed glued to his 6, lined up the shot, and fired. A burst of 50 cal tracers ripped through the bomber's wing root, sending it spiraling into the sea. The second raider dove low, trying to escape using speed and gravity. That trick worked on normal P-47s. This was not a normal P-47. Collier rolled, dropped behind him, and closed the gap so fast the German gunner didn't even fire. A 3-second burst ended the chase. 2 kills, 1 sortie, barely 10 minutes in the air. When Collier returned, the entire squadron, fuel crews included, stood waiting in silence. They didn't cheer. They didn't joke. They stared at the plane, at the propeller, at the man who had returned with combat results no Thunderbolt should have achieved. Under the dim lanterns, the aircraft didn't look like a machine. It looked like a secret. This was the night the squadron learned the truth. Bennett hadn't just created a more efficient propeller, he had created a weapon. The next morning, the base felt different. Not louder, not busier, just tenser, like the air itself was holding its breath. Men spoke in low tones. The mechanics didn't joke. The pilots didn't swagger. Everyone kept glancing at Bennett's modified P-47, parked under a canvas sunshade as if hiding it from prying eyes might keep rumors from spreading. It didn't. By noon, the story had already reached command headquarters. A staff car rolled onto the field. Olive drab, dustless, far too clean to belong to anyone who worked for a living. Two officers stepped out, clipboards in hand. Expressions like men who had already decided the verdict before hearing the case. They walked straight to Bennett. No salutes, no greetings. "You performed unauthorized modifications to an aircraft essential to the war effort," one officer said. "You violated pitch stop regulations, structural integrity standards, and propeller length safety limits," said the other. Then came the sentence. "You are hereby removed from active maintenance duties pending investigation." Around them, the mechanics bristled. Pilots clenched their jaws. Nobody dared speak, not because they agreed, but because they knew exactly what kind of bureaucracy they were dealing with. Bennett simply wiped his hands on a rag and said, "So you've grounded the one man keeping your aircraft in the sky. Brilliant." The officers ignored him and moved to inspect the P-47. They examined the trimmed blades, the reshaped tips, the filed pitch stops. Every detail screamed violation. Every detail also screamed breakthrough. One of them traced the modified edge with a fingertip, frowning. "This shouldn't work," he said. Bennett answered from behind him. "Tell that to the two raiders Collier shot down." That comment earned him a threat of formal charges. But the truth was already bigger than any reprimand. Collier's combat footage, cockpit audio, engine data, and the impossible climb rate had been recorded. Not as an experiment, simply as routine flight data. Command analyzed it, expecting to find error. What they found instead was a pattern: reduced drag by nearly 20%, improved thrust recovery at altitude, faster feathering response, and shockingly low fuel burn. Numbers that matched nothing in the Army Air Force's manual, and nothing the Germans had ever seen. That night, Collier confronted the officers directly. "You're punishing the man who gave you the only Thunderbolt that can chase a jet." The senior officer stiffened. "We can't authorize field modifications of this magnitude." "So you'd rather lose pilots than admit a mechanic figured out what your engineers couldn't?" Silence. Thick enough to choke on. The verdict arrived the next morning. Bennett would not be court-martialed, not because he was innocent, but because his work was too useful to bury. His propeller design was to be confiscated, classified, and quietly studied by engineering teams stateside. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, copies of his blade geometry began appearing in sealed envelopes delivered to hand-picked maintenance chiefs across Europe. The Air Force couldn't credit Bennett. But they couldn't ignore him either. As for the P-47 itself, it was grounded pending structural review, which everyone understood meant one thing. They wanted the plane as evidence, not as a weapon. Collier fought the order until he realized the truth. They weren't grounding the plane to punish Bennett. They were grounding it because it was too important to risk losing in combat. Before the mechanics hauled it into storage, Collier climbed onto the wing one last time. He placed his hand on the battered metal and whispered, "You were the future." Bennett stood a few feet away, watching his creation disappear behind hangar doors. For a moment he looked defeated, but only for a moment, because every man in that squadron knew something the officers didn't, something that would outlast any regulation or reprimand. The forbidden propeller had worked. It had changed what a Thunderbolt could be. And long after the paperwork was forgotten, the story remained. To the squadron, Bennett wasn't a mechanic anymore. He was the man who bent physics, and won. When the war ended, the pilots of the 389th Fighter Squadron scattered across the country, returning to farms, factories, small towns, and quiet lives that had nothing to do with prop pitch, climb rates, or classified engineering memos. But every reunion, every letter, every story told over a beer circled back to one impossible chapter: the night a mechanic with a file, a hacksaw, and more instinct than any textbook could teach, built a propeller that made a Thunderbolt behave like a machine from 10 years ahead of its time. Bennett never sought recognition. He went home, took a job in a small-town garage, and tuned cars with the same effortless intuition that once reshaped an aircraft's destiny. Customers didn't know they were watching a man who had secretly rewritten aviation physics in a military tent. They just knew their cars ran smoother when he touched them. Sometimes a former pilot would stop by, stand in the doorway, and exchange a quiet nod, a gesture that carried more respect than any medal. They all remembered the same thing: the night they realized one mechanic had outsmarted engineering boards, command structures, and the Luftwaffe in a single stroke. And somewhere in a locked warehouse, a P-47 with shaved blades and altered pitch stops sat under a tarp, gathering dust. The files on its performance were sealed. The reports were buried. But the men who had seen it climb into the night, outrun Luftwaffe raiders, and glide for hours whispered the truth for decades. The Air Force said it never happened. We know better. This story isn't about breaking rules for the sake of rebellion. It's about the kind of genius that comes from grease-stained hands and a willingness to trust what the math could be, not just what the manual said it was. It's about courage. Not the courage to fly into gunfire, but the quieter kind. The courage to imagine a better machine, even when authority says you can't touch it. So here's the question to leave you with. How many breakthroughs in WWII were born not from laboratories, but from the minds of men who weren't supposed to innovate at all? If you love stories where forgotten brilliance beats bureaucracy, where battlefield ingenuity outpaces official doctrine, and where one mechanic with a crazy idea changes the course of a mission, a squadron, or even a war, make sure you're here for the next episode. Because the truth is simple: history isn't just shaped by heroes who fly. It's shaped by the ones who make them fly.